So, what actually do we have to do to feed everybody in the world well forever without wrecking the rest? And it's all explained in my book, but in a nutshell, at the moment, agriculture is designed, it is not actually designed to feed people. Agriculture at the moment is designed to maximize wealth for the people who run it. And the idea is that if you maximize wealth somehow or other, enough food will be produced for everybody. It doesn't actually work, as I've just been suggesting. And so it's designed purely on what are called economic lines, which are quite arbitrary, but they are in fact neoliberal economic lines. If we're serious about feeding people, we actually have to recognize that providing enough food for everybody without wrecking the rest is a problem with biology, and we have to design agriculture along biological lines. And to do that, and we have to say to ourselves, well, if we're going to feed 9 billion people, we need to be productive. Of course we do. We need to produce quite a lot of food. We also need to be sustainable. We need to be able to go on doing this effectively forever. So we need it for the next 1,000 years, the next 10,000, the next million years. There is no good biological reason why the human species shouldn't be here in a million years' time. Although as things are, well, you know, many of us will be lucky to be, well, many people are saying we'll be lucky to get through the next century in a tolerable state, the way things are. But we should be thinking about the next million years. And the last thing we have to be is resilient. Because resilience isn't the same as sustainability. Sustainability means you have to be able to go on doing it. But resilience means you have to be able to go change direction as conditions change. And we know that the conditions are changing. We know, for example, spectacularly, that global warming is happening. The climate is changing. And we have to be able to change direction in agriculture quite radically and quite quickly. If we treat this as a biological problem, we might say, well, let's look for a biological precedent, and all we have to do is look at nature itself. How does nature do it? Because nature has been pretty damn productive for the last 3.8 billion years without interruption, which makes it pretty damn sustainable. And it has done this even though the climate has gone from being pole-to-pole tropics to being pole-to-pole ice, and back again several times. It always manages to come through, it always manages to be versatile. And how does it do it? How does it actually do it? And it does it first of all by being very, very diverse. And you can have arguments about whether diversity leads to productivity and whether it leads to sustainability. And some ecologists say, no, it doesn't, there's no simple relationship. But actually, if you argue it through, you see, of course, there's a relationship. And the diversity of nature absolutely matters. That's what gives it its power and its strength. And the second thing is it's very, very beautifully integrated. So there's no waste in nature. One creature dies, another gobbles it up, and so on and so on and so on. And then it is low input. The ecosystem more or less relies on the inputs that are there. All ecosystems borrow from other ecosystems, but on the whole, they use what's there. So we want to, if we're going to have agriculture that imitates nature and is productive, sustainable, and resilient, what do we have to do? We want agriculture that is very, very diverse. In other words, actually that translates into mixed farms. Mixed farms. And mixed farms doesn't mean that you simply keep a lot of livestock and a lot of different kinds of crops, like animals in a zoo or like plants in a botanic garden, where they're all separate, where they're all just doing their own thing. It means an integrated system, so the actual farm becomes a kind of ecosystem. And I reckon, we've got farmers in this room, so they can disagree or not, but I reckon some of the best examples of this were in Britain, say, in the 1950s, when we were devising very beautifully integrated farms with dairy and arable and horticulture and pigs and sheep, all together in often quite small farms of 100 acres or less than 100 acres. And that was a model of biological efficiency. And the third thing is, if you want to reduce the inputs, which of course you do want to reduce, then I'm not going to say that organic farming is the be-all and end-all, and rules as they stand are the answer, but they are the best exemplar of what can be done. And the organic farmers have been carrying the flag, as it were, of sensible farming for the last 40-odd years. And so I would say that, not that we should all run out and sign up to the Soil Association. You're already organic here anyway. But that organic farming worldwide should be the default position. It should, as a matter of course, be what farmers do. unless there is a very good reason to do something else. Now, if you have mixed farms which are tightly integrated and are low input, in other words organic, they are going to be very, very complicated. If they're complicated, they've got to be labour intensive, certainly by modern standards, they've got to be labour intensive. If they're labour intensive and complicated, there's no advantage in scale up. If there's no advantage in scale up, then you finish up with the idea that what we actually need to feed the world is mixed, labour-intensive, small to medium-sized farms. This is what biology tells you. This isn't ideology, this isn't nostalgia, this is what the biology tells you. Now the modern policy, which is industrial farming, geared to the neoliberal economy, is the absolute opposite of that. The neoliberal economy, industrial model of agriculture, says no, the aim is to make as much money as possible in the shortest possible time, using whatever resources are available, provided they're cheap. And if you do that, you've got to maximise productivity, maximise yield, even though we don't actually need to increase the yield that much more than is already. We're already producing as much food as we need. In fact, nevertheless, the emphasis always is on more output the whole time. And it's more fertiliser on the fields to produce even bigger yields from wheat, no matter what the collateral damage is. It's more yield from cows, so that we now have cows that routinely, in some herds, are producing 2,000 gallons of milk a year, which is about 7 or 8 times more than a wild cow would produce, which is about 2 or 2.5 times more than a traditional cow in a small herd would produce. They've got udders like this, they get mastitis. The average herd life, I think, in this country for a dairy cow is 1.8 lactations, which means they die at the age of 3, or they're slaughtered at the age of 3 with mastitis and bad feet and God knows what. Whereas traditionally kept cows sometimes will get through 10 lactations, slaughtered at the age of 12, etc., etc. Wild cows can live for 15 years. So this is the kind of pressure we're putting on livestock in the course of productivity. And the second thing you need to do if you really want to make money out of farming is to add value, so we have all this nonsense of packaging, and this is actually the reason why people nowadays produce so much meat, because it's a way of turning cheap fodder, including grain, which we could perfectly well be eating ourselves, into something very, very expensive. It's an exercise in value adding, it's not an exercise in nutrition and gastronomy, as we are told. But the third thing you have to do if you want to make maximum money out of farming is to simplify, is to cut labour. And if you cut labour, first of all, you have to simplify the husbandry. So the idea of a complex system of the kind that we need goes right out of the window, because you can't possibly have all that labour, because it's too expensive. So we find these huge monocultures. In Lincolnshire, for example, it's common to find one person full-time on a farm of 1,000 hectares, 2,000 acres, which previously, 100 years ago, might have employed 200 or 300 farm workers. But get rid of the labour is the best way to save money. And if you're going to do all these things and you use loads and loads of oil, loads and loads of engineering, loads and loads of industrial chemistry to make up for the fact that the husbandry is so simple, and if you're going to farm in this very, very simplified way, you have the farms as big as possible, because you get tremendous advantages in scale up. So you have this huge, monocultures that go as far as the eye can see. In order to consolidate, to centralise the control of these things, you introduce technologies like GMOs, and you make it necessary for people to buy their seed from a few companies, and you have the EU reducing the number of varieties that can be sown, and so on and so on and so on. Scale up, money, centralisation, that's what it's all about. It happens to be the case that agriculture the world over is by far the biggest employer. I think something like 40% of everybody in the world works in agriculture. Half the people in the world live still on the land, and most of them are engaged in agriculture. So if other countries followed our lead and reduced the labour in the way that we have, we've now got 1% of people on the land in this country, 1% full-time farmers of the labour force. If other countries followed our example, you'd have something like 2 billion people out of work. You'd have 500 million people, 500 million people out of work in India alone, if they followed our example. And yet Western governments are actually actively encouraging third world governments to follow our lead. And they say that they're very stupid and so on, and if they don't. Now you might say, why, if it's so easy to feed people actually, which I think it is if you do it properly, why don't they do that? And the answer is, in the short term, because they are in fact committed to the the neoliberal economy and the idea you've got to make money and all that kind of stuff. But I would say the deeper reason why they don't change direction is because they don't have an appropriate worldview. They don't have the right metaphysics. They've forgotten what metaphysics is. And there's a quite different way of looking at the world. And you don't actually have to say that the world is just stuff. I mean, the idea to me is crucial. It's the idea of transcendence. And transcendence, in a very crude nutshell, is the idea that there is, in fact, more to the universe than meets the eye, and that the material stuff that we can touch and measure and stub our toes on is, as it were, the surface of things. I mean, it seems to me to be a crucial issue that runs right through all religions, for example, the notion that there's more going on. And embedded in the idea that there's more going on is the idea that actually the universe isn't mindless, it isn't purposeless, but actually has consciousness embedded within it. And this kind of crude version of Darwinism, which says that all life is driven by competition to the death, you know, nature red in tooth and claw, it doesn't square with what one sees if one looks more carefully at nature. You see that in nature is far more cooperative than it is competitive. And if that were not the case, actually life would fall apart. Life would be quite impossible. And you could say, you know, competition happens, but cooperation is actually the essence of the whole damn thing, actually. And as for this idea that we can understand everything and therefore we can control everything, this is total nonsense. I mean, there is just huge... Anyone that knows anything about the philosophy of science knows that science takes a very, very limited view of what the world is like. And that's why it's so successful. It defines the questions it's going to look at very, very carefully. And once you begin to see that science is limited, you begin to see that there's a huge limit, there's an obvious limit to what we can know about the world if we just do science. And more generally than that, we can say there is an obvious limit to what we can know about the world, full stop, whatever line we go down. We also say to ourselves, if we want to get a better view of the world than science can give us, then we have to rely on methods that are not purely scientific, and not in fact purely rational. And not being rational doesn't mean being irrational, which means being mad. It simply means not relying totally on these kind of logical processes. In other words, you have to rely much more heavily on intuition. In other words, you have to cultivate intuition in order to get some sense of what the universe is really like. And if you take all these ideas, you know, the essential benignity of the world and the essential mysteriousness of the universe, and the idea of transcendence and the idea of cooperativeness, I think out of this emerges a very, very simple ethic, which I suggest is the, well, not just me suggesting it, other people have suggested, is the essence of all the ethics that underpins all the great religions. The idea of humility, because the world is really seriously beyond our ken. The idea of respect, because, you know, it is a sentient universe, for goodness sake, it needs to be treated respectfully. And the idea of reverence, because, you know, what else can you do when you're surrounded by this except feel this sense of reverence for nature. Now, it seems to me that if you had this view of life, the transcendence and mystery and all the other things, and reverence for respect for other creatures and reverence for the world as a whole, we simply wouldn't dream of farming the way we now farm. We wouldn't treat animals as commodities. It would be entirely obscene. You know, we wouldn't be hacking down rainforests in order to grow a bit more soy in order to make more pigs, and all those things we do. We wouldn't be allowing 1 billion people to be hungry when it's not necessary. We wouldn't be treating animals with tremendous cruelty, etc. We wouldn't be wiping out half our fellow species. It isn't a question of making laws or adjusting the economy to prevent these things happening. I mean, it is that, but it isn't just that. It's actually a question that these things should be unthinkable to us. Just unthinkable. We couldn't do them any more than we could countenance, you know, just out-and-out murder. It would not be something that we could encompass. And yet, because we've got no metaphysics, because we've got this crude view of how the world really is, this has become the norm. So I think the kind of thing you're talking about, Aaron, is of absolutely fundamental importance, and thank you very much.